Welcome. If I may please have everyone's attention. Thank you. Welcome. My name is Jenna Moe. I'm the Senior Director of the Society of Fellows here at the Aspen Institute, and it is an absolute honor to spend the evening with all of you. Thank you for joining us tonight for this fantastic talk. If you are not already familiar with the Society of Fellows, we are the membership program of the Aspen Institute, and I have so much gratitude to extend to all of our members for helping to make evenings like tonight possible, increasing the accessibility for our public programs to the whole community, and making these talks free and open to the public. So thank you to members. I'd also like to extend gratitude to Lugano Diamonds and Moti and Adit Furter for their underwriting of the Society of Fellows program. As members, we go deep with the work of the Institute at events across the country, roundtables, salons, where we get to interact with policy program directors, people from our leadership programs, and thought leaders and topic experts. And tonight is a special night. I am delighted to introduce my colleague and member of the senior executive team, Maria Osabal, who will introduce our fantastic program.
Thank you, Jenna. Good evening and welcome to the Murdock Mind, Body, Spirit series at the Aspen Institute. As Jenna said, my name is Maria Osabal, and I'm the Vice President of Strategy and the Corporate Secretary at the Institute, and I am delighted to see you all here this evening. I want to start with a deep note of gratitude for our sponsors this evening, Gina and Jerry Murdock, not only for their generous support, of this series, but also for all that they do for the Institute and for the community, including Jerry's service on our Board of Trustees. I'd also like to thank our underwriters and our donors who make it possible for us to keep community programming affordable and accessible all year round. Tonight, I am honored to welcome to this venerable stage two remarkable women. Our featured speaker is Dr. Lori Gottlieb. She is a psychotherapist and New York Times bestselling author of Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, a book that has sold over 1 million copies and is being adapted into a television series. I read the book shortly after it came out, and when I hear 1 million+ copies sold, what I think about is direct impact on the lives of so many people. In addition to her clinical practice, Lori is also the co-host of the very popular podcast Dear Therapist and the author of Atlantic's advice column, Dear Therapist. May I add here that as a self-proclaimed superfan, I have not missed a single podcast or a single column, and I can say that in every bit of work, there is something important and helpful that I can apply to my own life. Our moderator this evening is Aspen Institute Trustee and Henry Crown Fellow, Carla Piñeyro Sublett. Carla is a 25-year veteran of the tech industry, most recently as Chief Marketing Officer for IBM. She's a master of proactive demand generation, enhancement of customer engagement, and of bold brand reinvigoration. Her passions are so well aligned with the mind, body, spirit theme of this series that I want to mention them here tonight. Carla is passionate about connection, design, travel, giving back, and wellness, all aspects that no doubt animate the concept that we talk about as the Aspen idea. So Carla and Lori, welcome to our stage, and thank you for letting all of us be a part of your conversation tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Wow. So I have to be honest, I have to come clean here. I avoided therapy like the plague. and quite frankly, hated it, had attempted it and failed. And it wasn't until the Aspen Institute that I really started to think about mind, body, spirit, and my mental health being part of my overall wellness journey. And in the last couple of years, going through a period of significant healing actually brought me to your work, Lori. So it's a big honor to be talking to you today, and I'm super excited to get a chance to interview you.
Well, thank you. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy to be able to have the conversation with you in particular.
Thank you. Okay, so let's get right to it. I was going to ask the audience who's actively in therapy, but I don't think I want to put y'all on the spot.
Maybe the question should be, do you have a family member that you wish were in therapy?
Beautifully put. So, Lori, in your book, you begin the book by really establishing yourself as not just a therapist, but as a person, by saying that you are a card-carrying member of the human race. And what made you include yourself in the book in such a vulnerable way? And were you worried about your patients actually reading about it?
Yeah, so just so I have a sense, how many of you have read the book? Okay, so some of you know that I was supposed to be writing a book about happiness, and that the book about happiness was making me depressed and miserable. Because I felt like happiness as a goal in and of itself is kind of beside the point, that we get joy from meaning, from purpose, from connection. And that's what I saw every day in the therapy room. So I knew I wanted to bring people into the therapy room to let people have the privilege that I have of being able to have these real human stories and see people kind of grow and change and all these heroic moments that happen. I included myself because I thought it feels really disingenuous that I was going through something at the time and I was going to therapy at the time, and I didn't want to position myself as the expert up on high. So like I say in the book, I know what it's like to be a person in the world, and I think that makes me do my work better.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the happiness book. What made you decide not to write it, and how did you come to terms with that?
Yeah, very easily, because I hated it. It was one of these things where, again, I felt like what real life was happening in front of me every day, and I wanted other people to be able to be kind of like a fly on the wall. And that's what we do even in the podcast that was mentioned a few minutes ago, where we do actual sessions with people and you get to listen in on them and then hear what happens after the session, after we give them kind of homework to do and they do it and we see what happens. Because I think a lot of people have misconceptions. They think that therapy is like you come in, you download the problem of the week, you leave, come back, you complain about something else, you leave. That's not therapy. That's talking to your best friend. So therapy is where we really want you to understand that you have agency, understand your role, understand even if, we always say before diagnosing someone with depression, make sure they aren't surrounded by assholes, right? So it's not to say there aren't difficult people. Some people are getting
That's
that a little late.
what it was.
It's not that there aren't difficult people or circumstances. Of course there are. But the question is, what is our role and how do we react and how do we participate in that dance and can we be doing something different? So, that's really the work of therapy. And I think that's what I want people to see, is that so much can change where people think, oh, I'm waiting for the other person to change. You don't have to wait for the other person to change. You can change. And that will influence how other people around you interact with you.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that I really like about you is the accountability aspect of your work and understanding your role and the dynamics that you have and the relationships that you have. I've heard you talk about the dance and the fact that you have to be able to change your dance steps before your partner can change. Tell me a little bit more about that. I'd love to hear your perspective because I think a lot of times, for example, I'll be vulnerable in marriage counseling. You go into it thinking these are the things my spouse needs to change.
Yes.
Not recognizing that your role is significant in that dynamic.
Yeah, I think so many people, especially with couples therapy, but even as parents, right? It's like, if my kid would do this, then I would react this way. And so often when people come to therapy, most people want change. Usually they want someone else to change, whether that person's in the room or not. And what I talk about is this dance that we do with people where, someone will say, well, I keep getting into this argument with my partner, right? And then the question is, well, what are you doing? And then what if you didn't do that? And what would happen? What if you did something different, in fact? And when you do something different, the other person either has to change their dance steps or they're going to fall flat on the dance floor. Usually, they'll change their dance steps. If they fall flat on the dance floor, that's good information too. They're not willing to do a different dance with you.
Along those lines, change isn't easy. Change is really hard. And many of us approach therapy because we want to change something. But even when we see it and we see what we have to change, we still don't do it. What makes that so? And I actually feel for y'all, because you probably have to sit in week after week, hour after hour, hearing us talk about the same thing over and over, knowing exactly what we need to do and not doing it. What makes it so hard to change?
Yeah, well, this is exactly why New Year's resolutions tend not to work out for a lot of people. It's not like the Nike slogan, just do it. Change is really complicated because in this paradoxical way, with change comes loss, even if you're leaving something that has been making you miserable. So maybe it's a relationship, or maybe it's a job, or whatever it is. But you usually are giving up something that felt familiar to you. And we as humans don't do that well with uncertainty. We would rather cling to the misery of certainty than think about what might happen with going somewhere that we haven't been before. And then there are stages of change. There's a chapter in the book called How Humans Change, and it takes you through the different stages, and it starts with pre-contemplation, where we don't even know we're thinking about making a change. There's contemplation, where you're thinking about it, but you're not ready to do anything about it yet. That's when people come to therapy. Then there's like a stage where you're going to take steps to make the change happen. And so you're doing all of the preparation. And then there's action, where you make the change. Most people think, okay, that's the last stage, action, you've made the change. No, the last stage is maintenance, and it's how do you maintain the change? And it doesn't mean that you don't fall back. Built into maintenance is the very realization that you're like Chutes and Ladders, you're going to fall back down. And then what do you do with that? So how do you hold yourself accountable but with compassion? So a lot of people will say like, oh, I said I was going to, exercise in the new year. I was going to eat this way, or I was going to do whatever I was going to do. And then, or I was going to break up with this person. And then it's 3 a.m. and I called that person, or I ate that cake, or I didn't exercise. And then they think I failed. No, this is just part of maintenance. You didn't fail. Change is really, really hard. So you have to say to yourself, look, this is what happened on this day. And now I'm going to go back to the strategies that help me stay on track tomorrow. But I'm not going to beat myself up. Self-flagellation never helps anyone change in the long term. It helps you sometimes in the short term, but it never helps in the long term. And one way to think of it is if your child came to you and they said, hey, I messed up on this test. Would you scream at them? Would you tell them they're dumb? What would, that's how we talk to ourselves. We are so unkind to ourselves. So you might have compassion for them and at the same time hold them accountable. Like, okay, that was this test. What can you do differently? Do you need to go into the teacher for help? Do you need to study differently? Did you not get enough sleep? And so you're holding those two things at once, the compassion and the accountability. And we need to do that for ourselves if we truly want to change and have it last.
Yeah, especially given how much we talk to ourselves. I heard you do an exercise that I thought was really cool that maybe we'll repeat here in terms of who's the person you talk to the most.
Yes. Well, I'll just ask it. Who is the person? Well, we kind of gave it away, but who is the person that you talk to most in your daily life? Yourselves. So most people, if they weren't primed, they would say, oh, it's my husband, it's my wife, it's my best friend, it's my mother, it's my sibling, right? We do talk to ourselves the most. We just don't realize that voice is going through our heads. And so I remember I had a client who was so self-critical, but she didn't realize it like most of us. And so I said, listen, I want you to listen to how you talk to yourself, and I want you to just write down everything you say to yourself over the course of the week, and then next week we'll talk about it. So she was very skeptical, but she came back the next week, and she gets out her phone where she had written down everything, and she started to cry. And she said, I am such a bully to myself, I can't even read this. And then she started to read some of it, and they were things like she was writing an email and she made a typo, and the voice in her head immediately said, "You're so stupid." She would never think that of someone who was typing an email and they made a typo. She saw her reflection as she was walking down the street in a glass mirror, and she said, "Oh, you look terrible today." right? But think about how many times we do this to ourselves in a way that we would never say that to someone that we love or care about.
Yeah.
So the questions that I told her to ask are, before you talk to yourself, or anyone really, is it kind? Is it true? And is it useful? And it has to meet all three criteria: kind, true, useful. And if it doesn't, you need to change the way that you talk to yourself and that you talk to others.
Yeah. You know, I had no idea. I recently did a silent retreat, and with a goal, the end in mind being to reconcile with that voice inside of the head. And I went into it assuming, you know, I'm doing pretty well. I feel relatively happy, and you know, and I'm self-aware, but I'm confident. Boy, oh boy.
Yeah.
When you don't have any other input, that voice is brutal.
Yeah.
And not only is it brutal, I've learned through your work that it's inaccurate.
Yes.
And one of the things you talk about is the narratives that we have and how unreliable they are. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What makes those narratives exist? You know, and how can we deal with that aspect of us? And how does that undermine us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's why kind, true, and useful. So true is in there because what happens is we all have these stories that we carry around. We sometimes don't realize that we're carrying around these stories. Sometimes they're stories we learned when we were younger that people told us about ourselves that we thought to be true. Sometimes they're stories that we get from the culture. Sometimes they're stories that we made up because we had certain experiences and we said, well, that must mean this, because we like to make meaning out of things that happen to us. So we tell ourselves a story. Usually the stories are not very favorable to us. They're usually, something is wrong with me. You know, these stories like, I'm unlovable, or I can't trust anyone, or nothing will ever work out for me. Those are the kinds of stories, and they tend to affect our behavior just every moment of every day, the way we move through the world. So when people come in, they often have a story. We're all unreliable narrators. We tend to, you know, talk about a certain part of the story more, leave out other parts. But when we get to the truth of the story, it turns out that their stories weren't very accurate. Not only about themselves, but usually about the people that they're telling the stories about. Like, there's more to that story. With couples, I'll often say, I want you to tell this story from the other person's perspective. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, I knew it, but I didn't really want to address that part of the story. So I think it's really important that one of the things that we really do in therapy is I feel like having a background as a writer, I feel like I'm an editor as a therapist where I'm helping people to edit their stories and to get rid of the faulty narratives so they can really see themselves and the people in their lives more clearly.
You did something very profound on one of your podcasts where there was an individual that you were talking to that had had an affair and had actually left his wife for his quote-unquote love of his life. And the thing that, and these are my words, the thing that he was struggling with from my perspective was he didn't really have empathy for his wife. And you did something really beautiful, which was you had him tell the story from the perspective of his wife. Mm-hmm. And it was actually really powerful to see him kind of the light bulb go off and to see him realize, you know, what the experience was like for her. And for me, that was really powerful.
Yeah, and I think what that illustrates in that episode, that one was called Mike's Messy Affair. And I think that what that illustrates is he had so much shame that when people don't have empathy, usually the reason that they can't feel compassion for someone or have empathy for someone is because if they acknowledge that they hurt someone, then they feel so much shame that they did that. And so they can't see both parts of that. So we helped him a little bit with the shame. And then he was able to say, oh, wow, I really hurt her in this profound way.
Mm. Does that have any relation to the pain hierarchy that you talk about and kind of how we make up this story about hierarchy of pain and then it enables us to avoid certain emotions and dismiss certain emotions? Will you explain that concept to us?
Sure. Let me just say one thing, though, because I think before I get to that, which is that, you know, I think that there's a difference when men come into therapy and women come into therapy. So this was a guy on the podcast. And I think it's especially hard for men to really be vulnerable. I don't think that as a culture, we really allow for that to happen. So a lot of people say just men aren't that way. Men really are that way. They feel all the same feelings we do. They just were brought up in a culture that told them, no, you can't talk about this. When men come into therapy, often they'll say something like, I've never told anyone this before. And they literally have not told a soul, even if they have a great marriage, great friends, great family. And then the thing that they say is something that women talk about over lunch, right? Like that to them. And I'm not minimizing. What I'm saying is that they truly, like, for them, they have no experience talking about something personal, whereas women will come in and they'll say, I've never told anyone this before except for my mother, my sister, my best friend. So like the bar is at a different place for men. And even in couples therapy, often it's a woman who comes in and says to her husband, I really feel disconnected from you. I wish you would open up more. I wish you would tell me more about your inner life, and then we could connect more. And then he's sitting right there on the couch, and he starts to open up. And maybe he gets a little teary, or maybe he actually starts crying. And inevitably, in whatever way, she will look at me like a deer in headlights. Like, wait a minute, I don't feel safe when he doesn't open up to me, and I don't feel safe when he's crying like this in front of me either. So what's he supposed to do? And I think that that's something we really need to consider, is that I see this every day. You guys don't get to see this every day, but you probably see it in some aspect of your lives with whether you have a son or a brother or a husband or a father or just a friend, that we really need to be aware of the messages that we're sending men around vulnerability, because it's, if you say, I want you to really be vulnerable with me, but then you feel profoundly uncomfortable when they're not going to open up to you.
So how do we foster that with our sons, with our husbands, with our children? I know we have sons close in age.
We do.
How do you foster that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's that you have to treat your kids and everybody in your life the same. So, a lot of parents, you start to see the differences when they have sons and daughters, for example. And so you see, like, the little girl fall down at the park. Oh, honey, are you okay? The little boy fall down at the park. It's okay. Shake it off, right? At what age does that start? That starts around kindergarten, first grade, when we start to treat them differently. So again, that's something to be aware of. And so with your boys, you want to be like, hey, they're upset about something. Oh, tell me more. Just those 3 words, tell me more. Yeah. Let them talk. You would do that with your daughters too. You do that with anybody. You do that with your husband. You do that with your brother. Tell me more, I'm here. And you notice if you're having a reaction, that is so about you, not about them.
Mm-hmm. And the importance of emotion, and
Yes.
how important that information is, and making sure we don't cut people off or enable our boys to be cut off from those emotions.
Yeah, well, they have them. The question is, what do they do with them? Mm-hmm. So boys don't, none of us do. I mean, this is just across the board with anybody. If we, for whatever reason, feel like we are not allowed to talk about our feelings, they come out in other ways. They come out in addictions, or they come out in insomnia, or they come out in a short-temperedness, or they come out in a lack of direction, or they come out in relational difficulties that keep repeating themselves. So you might not be talking about your feelings, too much wine, too much food, not enough food. They're going to come out behaviorally, because feelings have to come out. Like there's a valve that's going to open up at some point, and whether you're talking about it or not, they're going to come out.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say someone realizes that they are ready to go to therapy. They're a little bit intimidated by it. I personally, as I mentioned at the beginning, was very intimidated by it. What are some of the myths? What is therapy? What are some of the preconceived notions that are incorrect from your perspective? And what does therapy today look like? Mm-hmm. And Lori, how do you know when you have a good therapist or a bad therapist? Because I think that's part of what turned me off.
Somebody's had some experience with that.
Yeah, that's part of what turned me off.
Yeah. So I think I'll start there, just because I think that that's the most important aspect of therapy, is your relationship with your therapist. And study after study shows that the relationship you have with your therapist is the biggest predictor of whether it's going to be effective for you. It matters more than their theoretical orientation, the number of years they've been practicing, their areas of expertise. That matters. So I'm not saying that doesn't matter, but of all the factors, how you feel in the room. Do you feel felt? Do you feel that you're being challenged? Do you feel comfortable? Do you trust this person? If you're just coming in for validation, again, I talk in the book about the difference between idiot compassion and wise compassion. So idiot compassion is, your friend says to you, like, listen to what my mother, my husband, my boss, whatever did today. And we say, yeah, they're wrong, you're right, you go, girl, right? We back them up because we think we're being a supportive friend. But often, if you listen to your friends enough, they're kind of coming to you with similar stories. And we're afraid to say, hey, have you noticed that that's been happening? We don't really question them at all. So wise compassion is what happens in therapy, where we kind of hold up a mirror to you and we help you to see something about your role in the situation that maybe you haven't been willing or able to see. The word compassion is in there because it's done very compassionately. So I think that people who go to therapy and they feel like nothing is changing, they're not getting wise compassion in therapy. What they're getting is they're getting someone who's going to sort of validate, yeah, that's really hard. Yeah, I can understand how you feel that way. This other person sounds terrible, right? That's not really therapy. That's a conversation that you'd probably have with a friend. A therapist, even in a first session, when people say, how do I even know if I'm going to someone who might be good for me? I always say that a first session is like a consultation. It's kind of like a first date. It's not like you're getting married. It's like, hey, I want to see what it's like to sit in a room with this person. And so if you leave that first session and you can answer two questions, one is, that feeling felt? Did I feel comfortable? Did I feel like this person understood me as much as someone can really understand you after 50 minutes of knowing you? But you get a sense, it's a vibe. The second question is equally important, which is, did they say something or ask something that made me think about something I was talking about in a different way? We're not going to challenge someone too much in a first session because we don't know the whole story yet. And people generally have a lot to unload in a first session because they've been waiting. It often takes people a long time to even get to that first session. But, I might say something like, and what do you imagine so-and-so is thinking, right? Just to get that in. Or has this happened to you before? Or did this feel familiar? Something very mild. But just so that you're thinking about, this is how we're going to be working together. I am going to be asking you these questions because we're going to go in there together. And I'm going to hold your hand as we do this, but we're going to go in there together and we're going to figure out some of these things that haven't been working and where you can make some changes. Mm-hmm. And so if you're not getting that, you probably aren't going to be making a lot of progress. You might have a nice place to go and unload, but you're probably not going to be making a lot of changes.
Yeah. You made me think of something that I hear from you a lot, which is the power of listening. Mm-hmm. And clearly in that description, you're talking about the therapist and whether or not you're being heard by your therapist. But obviously, listening has a significant impact on all of our relationships. Tell me a little bit about how we could all possibly become better listeners.
I think the first thing is that when I was in training to be a therapist, one of my clinical supervisors said, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. There's a reason for that ratio. And I'll never forget that. Because it didn't just apply to how you practice therapy. Actually, we talk a lot in therapy, so it's not just listening. But I think there's a lot that goes on with listening. It's body language. It's letting the pauses be there. It's letting people sit in the silence, knowing that your presence is what they really want. So how do you communicate presence? It's I'm with you. And that means I'm giving you space to actually talk, and I'm hearing you. I'm not thinking of what I'm going to say while you're talking. That's what we do a lot when we're talking with people that we love. We're thinking about, how am I going to respond to this? Because we're having all kinds of feelings ourselves. Oh, they're saying I'm bad. No, that wasn't my intention. I didn't mean to hurt them. Let me explain to them, right? So you're not even hearing how they were hurt or why they were hurt. We do that with our kids because we're really uncomfortable with their discomfort. So they say, oh, so-and-so didn't sit with me at lunch today, or I didn't get picked for the school play. And we think about, well, how are we going to help them fix it? Or I'm sad about something. And then we say, oh, let's go get ice cream. As opposed to, hey, tell me more. Again, those 3 words, tell me more. And they'll say, oh, I'm sad because of this. Oh, I can see that. Tell me more about that, right? Or I'm really worried about this. So many times we'll say, oh, don't worry about that. Oh, it's going to be fine. But no, we're trying to talk them out of their feelings. So what did they grow up thinking? I shouldn't feel these feelings. Because whenever I feel them, someone tries to tell me I'm not feeling sad, or I shouldn't feel worried. There's nothing to be worried about. As opposed to, oh wait, I learned that I can be sad and it's going to be okay. I learned that I can be worried about something and it's real. And that's okay too, because I figured out that I will survive the anxiety. So that's part of listening. The other part of listening is we often tend to listen in the way that we would like to be listened to without asking what someone needs. So if you're someone who likes someone to give you feedback, we're going to give you feedback, right? But without saying, hey, tell me how I can be helpful right now. Sure, I'm here. Tell me how I can be helpful. Someone might say, I just want to vent right now. Great. Then you know exactly what it is, because in that moment they just want to vent. And it might be that because you listened so well and they felt so held by you, that in 2 days they might come back and say, I was thinking about that thing that I told you about the other day, and I'm really curious about what you thought. Right? So in a different conversation, it's timing and dosage. So what do they want? What is the right timing when they're really riled up about something? That might not be the moment that they want feedback or they want some ideas about how to fix it.
Yeah.
Or they might be the opposite. They might say, I really can't figure out what to do. I'd love your ideas. But you don't know that if you don't ask. So just say to them, I'm here. How can I be helpful right now?
Yeah. And it's difficult because sometimes it's really hard not to take on that emotion and feel that discomfort and want to fix it for them. It's difficult to hold someone in their emotions and be there for them in a way that's not about you.
Right. When people come to you and they really want you to listen, they're not asking you to take away their feelings. They're asking you to sit with them in their feelings. That doesn't mean you have to become anxious or sad. It means that you can bear their feelings.
Yeah. Okay, I want to rewind to something that you said, because we made a realization in the courtyard when we were talking just a second ago. You were talking about when you're picking a therapist, it's about the feeling in the room. And you, your perspective in your book is that therapy over Zoom is a little bit like sex with a condom. It's how you described it, or therapy with a condom.
I should say my colleague just said this was before COVID, and so there were all these new ways of doing therapy, and there's such power of presence, as we all learned during COVID. There's nothing that can really replace the being in person with people. I think that what we discovered during COVID was that Zoom therapy was actually really effective. It's different, but it's still really effective. But before COVID, before we knew we were all going to be doing Zoom, a colleague had said that doing therapy on Skype was like doing therapy with a condom on, because it doesn't kind of capture it feels different. Let's put it that way. That was the analogy, not mine, but I do quote it in the book. And what I discovered, though, during COVID was that there was a different kind of intimacy to doing Zoom therapy. There was a woman that I had been seeing for a while, and when I saw her over Zoom, there was a cello in the room every time. And I said to her, whose cello is that? Thinking someone in the family played. It was hers, and it was really important in her life, but she had never brought it up because it was attached to all this pain. And who knows when or if that might have come up. There are some drawbacks, like there was a couple that I was seeing, and they were having a really difficult time, and she was crying, and then all of a sudden she moved in and got very close to him, and I thought, what just happened there? And I asked, and she said, oh, he took my hand, but it was under the screen. I didn't see it. In the room, I would have seen that. Mm-hmm. So, I think there are pros and cons of that, but I will say that it really made, I think, therapy accessible to so many people. A lot of people can't take off work or kids or whatever and get to an office every week, but they can get on Zoom every week. So I'm really glad that option exists.
Yeah. You've inspired me to go meet my therapist in person. After 2 years, I realized I've never met him in person. After you said that, I was like, ooh. Okay, speaking of therapists, you have a therapist.
I do.
And you're open about Wendell. And one of the things that you mentioned is that Wendell showed you a cartoon, a jail cartoon that made a very significant impact on you. What was that impact? What was that about for you?
Yeah, so for those of you who haven't read the book follows the lives of 4 of my patients, and then there's a 5th patient in the book, and that's me as I go to Wendell, my therapist, after something happens in my life. And at a certain point, I did all the same things in therapy that you think you're not going to do because you're a therapist, and yet you're a human first, and so you do all the same things. And one of the
Like
things,
what?
like repeating the same story over and over, thinking that he's going to change his perspective on it and side with you. And so, and also just sort of talking about, I was talking here with this jail cartoon about, just how I was sort of like, I couldn't do this. We talk about help rejecting complainers. Help rejecting complainers, we've either been them or know them. And help rejecting complainers are people who are always complaining about a situation. And then when you try to help them, they're like, yeah, that won't work because, or no, I can't do that because, or that's not going to, So it's like they don't really want a solution. That was me in therapy. And so so he said, you remind me of this cartoon, and it's of a prisoner shaking the bars, desperately trying to get out. But on the right and the left, it's open, no bars. So the question is, why can't we see that it's open? And then if we do see that it's open, why is it so hard to walk around the bars? And that's because, and I talk about this, what I discovered, which is, I think it comes back to what we talked about with change. With change comes loss. With walking around those bars, we have to make change, and we can't blame it on the prison bars anymore. Like every choice that we make now, with freedom comes responsibility. So we can have freedom, but we have to take responsibility for our freedom. So what are we going to do with our freedom? It's kind of like I always say, insight is the booby prize of therapy, because you can have all the insight in the world, but if you don't make change out in the world, the insight is useless. You can know exactly why this thing happens in your relationship, but if you don't make any changes, what is the point?
Yeah.
So you got to walk around those bars, and you have to take responsibility for your own life.
Yeah. Okay, so knowing that, what is one actionable thing that we could all do in our lives that you would encourage us to do to improve the quality of our lives?
Oh, so many. I would start with the kindness thing, though. I mean, I would say really, I would try it as an exercise and really write down everything you say to yourself, but not just yourself, to other people. And I would just notice, is it kind, is it true, is it useful? How much are you really, putting out into the world that just isn't accurate, isn't kind, isn't helpful? And then why are you doing that? And then how do you change that? That's something we can all do starting immediately.
Yeah. Which makes me think of the most uplifting thing that you say, which is, we're all going to die.
Yes. Yes.
So what is the quote? You say, life has a 100% mortality rate.
Yep.
So how does that inform your kindness, how you walk through the world? How should we think about that? What
Yeah.
makes you say that?
Yeah. I kind of freak people out. I did this in my TED Talk, and people went silent. But I think it's really important that we consider that life has a 100% mortality rate, because I think it helps us to live better. A lot of us think about legacy. I talk to a lot of people in the therapy room about legacy, and a lot of people think in this very kind of external way about legacy, and our legacy is being made every day. How are we? Are there harsh words coming out of our mouth? Are there kind words coming out of our mouth? How do we respond to a difficult situation? People are watching us. That's our legacy. And we're making it every second of every day. And that doesn't mean we have to be perfect. This is not about putting pressure on people. It's about just being more aware, being more intentional. When you wake up, if it was your last day, right? It doesn't have to be that way. Like, just think, when I wake up every day, do I wake up with intentionality? And usually that has to do with purpose and meaning. And this doesn't have to be some grand purpose. It's what is important to me. Am I living my life with meaning? And is there some kind of purpose? And how is that being manifested in my daily life? Again, it's not some grand thing. And so I think that that's really important, because if we think that we have forever, we get to it too late. And there's a story in the book, actually, about a woman who is about to turn 70, and she says, basically, if I don't change my life around by my 70th birthday, then I don't want to live. And it's never too late. I think she's a great example of turning her life around, even in that year, in these kind of extraordinary ways, that we all have the capacity to do that. But we have to be aware and intentional.
Yeah. Well, Lori, I want to thank you personally. You have made a significant impact on me and my journey in the last couple years. And I would say specifically, I think what makes your work so special is the fact that it is compassionate, it's actionable, and it's real. and it's connective. And so I'm very thankful for everything that you're putting out in the world. What's next?
Well, first of all, thank you for saying that, and thank you for the conversation. I think there's so many myths and misconceptions about therapy, and I read a recent study that said it takes 11 years between the time that someone first thinks, maybe I should go to therapy, and when they go. Now, I don't know, I have to look into where that statistic came from, but I know that it often takes weeks or months or sometimes years for people to actually get in a room, and I think it's because they have so many misconceptions about what it is, and there's so much stigma around that. Like, health is health. In fact, I can say just in the 2 minutes we have, you talked about the hierarchy of pain, but I didn't explain it. This is so important, I think, that when we think about our health, we have this hierarchy. So many people come into therapy for the first time, and they say, I didn't come because I was just feeling sad. And now I'm clinically depressed, right? I didn't come in because, I was anxious, but I have a roof over my head and food on the table and supportive people in my life, so I didn't really think that I should come. So there's no hierarchy. We don't do that with our physical health. By the way, I'm making this distinction, but there really is no distinction. Health is health, so I'm just doing it for the purposes of illustration here. But if you fall down and you break your wrist, you're not going to be like, I'm not going to the ER and I'm not getting a cast and I'm not going to take care of this because I don't have stage 4 cancer. We don't do that. We don't make this hierarchy. But we do that with our emotional health all the time. It's like, it's not that bad. Yeah, I'm sad and I'm not sleeping well, or I'm having trouble in this relationship, but look at all the good things I have. We're not like, I broke my wrist, but look at all the good things I have. We don't do that. So that's a big cultural shift that I think is happening now, where people are saying, wait a minute, my emotional health matters as much as my physical health, because health is health. But I really want us to examine when we kind of slip into that other model and we kind of downplay and minimize what we're experiencing, because it really hurts a lot of people. If you come into therapy later, we got to get you back to baseline. So we're dealing with now a crisis, and then we've got to deal with all the stuff that's happened in between, get you back to baseline, and then deal with sort of how you got here in the first place. And I think the part that breaks my heart the most is you've suffered unnecessarily for weeks, months, years, and there's no reason that people have to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you say health is health, because I'm at the perspective that it's the two are connected, the mind, body, spirit. It's all, or the three, it's all connected.
Yeah.
So they start to impact each other. Thank you, Lori.
Well, thank you.
So I've really enjoyed getting to know you as a person. Thanks for spending time with me. And now I think we're going to open it up for some questions.
Great.
The only thing that I want to say before we go into questions is, although it's very tempting to bring some of our personal issues to Lori right now and take full advantage.
This
of
is
the
not
fact
group
that it's a hot
therapy.
mic, I want to encourage us to focus on the topics that we discussed today versus our own personal issues, as tempting as it may be. Right. Yes, I don't know if we have a mic runner. Yes, we do.
Hi, thank you. So it isn't really along the lines of what we've been talking about, Lori, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, experience in art therapy.
I think that, there's a scene in the book where I actually danced with my therapist, and I wasn't actually going to put it in there because I thought people would think it was creepy or bizarre. But I use creativity so much in my work because I feel like that's where we can really connect, especially with the unspoken, things that we can't necessarily articulate but that live in kind of our cells. We have kind of memory, kind of muscle memory, body memory, and sometimes a lot of stuff that's been kind of held in for a long time comes out through creativity. I happen to live and work in LA, a lot of writers, a lot of other kinds of artists, and a lot of that comes into our work.
Yes, I think we had a question here. Then we've got some over on this side.
How opinionated should your therapist be? Should they take a position on whether you should do something or not?
That's a great question. That is a great question. So you're using the word opinionated. I would say, how much of their true selves do they bring into the room? And I say, bring your whole self into that room. And that's something that I really learned actually by watching my therapist, Wendell, kind of bring his whole self into the room. He was very unconventional, I think, for what our training showed us about therapy, and it really changed the way that I practice. I'm very honest with people. I don't necessarily, I give people homework, so I tell them what I think will be helpful for them, but I also call them on their kind of not doing things or their pattern in a relationship where they're not taking responsibility for it. If I see a couple, I recently saw a couple where nothing was going to change if she did not engage in the process. And she wasn't willing to do that. And sometimes you have to say, I don't want to waste your time. So I think you want to be honest with people. You want a therapist who you can really trust, because if things aren't going the way that they need to go, and that doesn't mean, I don't really have a horse in the race, like should you stay together, should you not stay together. You guys need to learn about each other to make that decision. But if you're not going to learn about each other, or one person's not willing to, I'll be really honest about that.
Thank you. I think we have a few questions on this end.
Hi, thank you. Children's Hospital in Colorado called mental health a state of emergency for youth. Suicide is the #1 cause of death in 15 to 24-year-olds. Carl Jung said that every therapist should have a therapist. So what's the argument for not having a therapist?
For a therapist not having a therapist?
No, but we're at a state now where we've normalized that physical and mental health are one, and everyone has been through some form of trauma. So to fast forward what you're talking about, it would seem there's an assertion that if you can do it, you should try to be in therapy, and it would help you become an all-around better person and emotional well-being growing.
Mm-hmm. I don't know that everybody needs to go to therapy. I think that it's a great experience for people to do. I think that if they have the access to it. I do think that in a world, if I could create sort of the ideal world around health, you would go once a year to, just like you check in for your physical, you would have an emotional check-in as well, because then you can decide, like, is there something, I think it should be preventative. I don't think it should be something like the medical model. The way medicine works is something goes wrong and then you go. Right? Now I think we're moving into medicine 2.0, which is, we're trying to teach people how to have a healthy lifestyle so that they can prevent some of these things. But it often doesn't really work that way in our medical system, and certainly not in our mental health care system. You come when something's wrong. And I think that people should come and really be able to say, like, this is what's going on in my life, and decide, do they want to, are there skills that they can learn? Are there coping mechanisms? What I really love is that in a lot of schools, they have wellness programs now where they're learning all these things that we never learned when we were growing up. Like, what is the difference between sadness and depression? How do you relate to somebody when this happens? What do we do? It's relational. It's about self-care. It's about anxiety. It's about stress. It's about dealing with your parents. Nobody talked to us about any of that. So I think it's great that it's part of the curriculum. So you can call it what you want, therapy, program at school, but I think mental health needs to be a part of everyone's life. They need a place for it.
Okay, a question in the back over here on this side.
So I work here in Aspen as a teacher, and one of the things that's been a huge struggle, it has over time, but certainly now, is we're in a rural place, even though it doesn't feel very rural, especially amongst all these people. And we need more access. What do we do with our kids when there is no access? Like, we don't know where to help our families go to when the access is so hard.
That's what I think is great about the opening up of Zoom therapy, because it's allowed so many people who don't have the resources in their community to reach out to therapists who are not in their community. So if you go on Psychology Today, you can see which therapists are appropriate for what you're looking for, but also take people from different areas. That's really changed since COVID.
Thank you. I think we had one more question in the back. Was somebody else raising their hand as well that we didn't get? There we go.
Thank you. Hi, Lori. Before my question, I want to say that my name is Rowan, and I'm 19 years old, and I really, really like your book, and it inspired me to hopefully one day become a therapist myself, so thank you for that.
Well, thank you for coming to this.
Of course. And, okay, so my question is, well, I have two. I'm trying to decide which one to ask. I'll ask one of them. It's kind of similar to what that person asked over there, but something that stuck out to me in your book was that you said therapy is, this is not like a direct quote, but something that's meant to like stop at one point. And I'm asking I've been in therapy since I was 13, and I have no intentions of stopping anytime soon. And I'm asking, what's your opinion about like staying in therapy, not just as a once a year kind of thing like you were saying, but more often?
Mm-hmm. That's such a good question. So many people don't understand sort of what happens with therapy because it's different for every person. So some people come in because there's something very specific that they are coming in to work through. Other people are coming because it really helps them understand themselves better, and they want to keep coming because it's like going to the gym. Mm-hmm. It's really helpful for them. So there's no one way of doing therapy. If you have been going to therapy since you're 13 and you find it really useful and you want to keep going, then that's great. That's a way that many people use therapy. But I think a lot of people get scared off because they think if I go to therapy, I'm never going to leave, so I'm not going to go. And so I don't want people to have that misconception. Often you will go to therapy, you'll work through whatever you're working through, you'll leave. If you had a great relationship with that therapist, you'll probably come back many times because life happens and different stressors occur in our lives, or just you want to talk something through with someone who really gets you and really knows your history and you've been through this experience together. So there are lots of ways to use therapy, and I think that the flexibility of it is really important for people to understand.
Yeah. Oh, two.
Can you? Oh, thank you. When do you stop having therapy and have a coach?
Oh, interesting.
So a lot of people like to make these big distinctions. There's sort of like a lot of therapists will say, well, that's not really that's a coach, right? I feel like the fact that people are reaching out and want to get someone to support them through different things and learn and grow and really be intentional about the way they're living their lives, I don't care who you go to. I think you'll get different things from them, just in terms of our training and the way that we work. But it's probably more about the personality, again, of your therapist. A lot of therapists do a lot of work that are similar to what coaches do. And coaches just don't have the therapy training, but they can be really valuable for very specific kinds of goals that you might have.
Hi, thanks, Lori. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've been in practice for a number of decades. And I would appreciate you discussing your point of view on self-disclosure and authenticity. And that's in the service of how do you find a therapist that's a good one and a good fit? Because you can get all kinds of self-disclosure and you think, oh great, this is a person that relates to me, but it may not be a good fit at all.
Right. So I talk about that in the book a little bit because I think self-disclosure, you have to ask yourself, why am I disclosing this? What is the purpose of it? I don't believe in the therapist as tabula rasa, blank slate, because I think you have to be human. But that also doesn't mean that you're going to be revealing a lot about yourself. It's more that you're a human in the room. It's not like talking to a brick wall. You're talking to a real person who has reactions. When Julie, for those of you who read the book, she's a young woman who has this cancer diagnosis, there were times when I cried in the room with her. So you're a real person. I had a colleague who saw someone whose child had Tourette's syndrome, and this therapist had a child with Tourette's syndrome, and eventually decided to reveal that because this person felt so isolated in her experience. And it actually was a really smart disclosure because it made her realize that, no, you really do get it. Because so many times people would say things to her, but they really didn't understand the day-to-day of what that experience was like. There's another example that I give in the book of a therapist who was going away to get married and go on his honeymoon. And he said, this was a young therapist, and he said, I'm going to be away, and the person didn't say where or what, or, and it was just very off-putting because it was a 3 weeks being away, so the person was concerned like maybe they're sick, and he could have just said like, I'm getting married, I'm going to be in Hawaii, right? And then no more, that's it. But he didn't, and the person found out about it and saw the ring when he came back, and it sort of felt like a breach of trust in a way. Like it felt like sort of a formality that didn't need to be a formality. So I think it also depends on who the patient is, right? Because sometimes it's a person that if they get this self-disclosure, they're gonna read into it and have all this meaning to it that doesn't really exist. So you have to know sort of like what level of functioning the person is at and what it means to them and why they would want to know it. But I think if you use it really strategically, it can be very powerful. And I know, by the way, like people Google their therapists. So she says innocently. So there'll be people who have come in my office and clearly they've Googled me, and they've never acknowledged that, and so they'll say things like, oh, and because you went to this school, right? And it's like, I never said that, or because you used to work here, or because, oh, and I know you have a son, right? And so they've Googled me, and then we talk about, that dynamic. But I think people are obviously curious. If you're going to talk and come in and talk about your life in this way, many people are curious. But I went down the rabbit hole with my therapist, and I always say, be careful, like, why do you want to know this information? I didn't find anything weird about my therapist, but I found out that his father had died of a heart attack very young. And because I read the obituary that I found through like all this, like going down the rabbit hole, I spent like hours and hours and hours doing this. And then when I came back, I had been talking about my father who had been ill, but my father was in his 80s. And I had been talking about like, what it would mean to lose him, because I was very, very close with my father. And then I came back to the next session and I was like, I can't talk about my father now because he lost his father when his father was like 50, right? And so, but it kind of slipped out, and then we had to talk about that. And so I think that's one of those things where, any information that you get, it will impact the dynamic in the room. So I would really, try to avoid going down the Google rabbit hole. And if you have questions, ask your therapist directly.
Oh, we have two over here and one up here. Hopefully we can squeeze them in.
Hi, thank you for impacting so many lives. The Global Burden of Disease study is giving us data that is really worrisome, and that's that degenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease is now the #1 fastest growing neurological disease. Not to shock anybody here, the #1 fastest neurological disease in medicine. It's going to overwhelm us. Same with Alzheimer's disease. What's your advice? I've worked my whole career to try to help develop centers and research and to develop families and interdisciplinary approaches, yet we have almost a 0% pickup of therapy for families and for spouses. And the dynamic changes when suddenly, one person within not only a marriage, but within an entire family has a degenerative disease and may have it for many years. What's your advice, and why are we failing so badly, and how do we turn the bus around?
Yeah. People really don't pay attention to the caregivers. It's really shocking. This is what happens. The caregivers come in and they say, this is happening to my partner, my parent, my sibling, whatever. And if I say, how are you? Oh, nobody's asking about, no, I'm not here to talk about me. I'm here to, how can I help this other person? And so I think it's really important that we don't forget about caregivers. Caregivers are so important. And when I say caregiver, that means how do you maintain your role as this person's spouse, as this person's, adult child, as this person's sibling or friend, and also care for them, but also care for yourself. And that's something that we talk about a lot in therapy. We actually did one of the Dear Therapist podcasts. Somebody came on, their husband had a chronic illness, and the question was, how can I still be a wife? And we want to have joy in our lives, we want to have all that, but I feel like the caregiver. People feel guilty talking about that, like I'm a bad person because I'm worried about myself when this person has to suffer in this way. And I think the whole system, as you were saying quite accurately, the whole system is suffering. And then how do you create that balance?
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. I'm going to squeeze one in. Oh, we have one right there. Okay, sorry.
Hi, Lori. I'm a therapist, and of course I had to read your book, and I loved it, and I thank you for it. I think there's something that we should talk about. I had a client just come to me recently who, a loved one, tried to commit suicide very recently, and she was very surprised because she didn't see any signs of depression. I think we know about the overt signs of depression, but could you speak just a little bit about the more subtle signs that people could be aware of so we can help our loved ones?
Yeah. First of all, depression in children often looks different from depression in adults. So we think of depression in adults as, anhedonia, meaning they don't get pleasure from the normal things that they would get pleasure from. A lot of like slowness of movement, fuzzy thinking, isolating, those kinds of things. Sometimes with certainly middle school teens, it comes out behaviorally. So they're acting really different. And then it's hard to know because you're like, well, they're teenagers. Of course they're acting different. But then, no, this is something different for this kid. And so I think that really the best thing that I can say about suicidal ideation is when people don't have somewhere to turn, that's when things get really dangerous. So lots of people are going to feel like maybe, this fantasy of like, oh, maybe things would be better if I didn't live, or I'm in such a hard place, I wish I weren't alive, or those kinds of things. If they have someone that they can trust and talk to, it generally can be managed and turned around. But if they don't, that's when, you see all these tragedies. So I think that all of us in this room, like, let's look around, let's make sure that we're, keeping a place where people can talk to us. A great example of this is, I had a client come to me recently, and she was saying that, they were really, like, they were punishing their daughter for all these different things that they thought she shouldn't be doing. And there was no conversation about, like, why she was doing this or why this was important to her or her own autonomy. It's like, no, this is how it should go, and you're too young. And we finally did a session where she came in, and the parents learned so much about their daughter that they didn't know. And it was so beautiful to watch. And I think sometimes, and the parents are really well-meaning. They're not bad parents. They're just parents who thought, our daughter's going off on the wrong track, and we've got to turn this around. But what they didn't realize was the way they were trying to turn it around was making their daughter unable to trust them and talk to them. Because if she tried to talk to them, there would be more consequences. We're taking away your phone. We're doing this. We're doing that. And then she became even more isolated. So I think it's really important, again, to just kind of think about how might we invite and welcome conversation.
Great. I know we're over time. I want to have this one last question. We're going to bring it home. No pressure.
No, your mic's coming to you.
No pressure. It's coming.
Hi, so I am also a therapist, and I was just wondering, how do you stay well, and like, how do you prioritize your own wellness and health and well-being? Because it can be hard being a therapist, and then life can happen, which can make things hard as well.
Yeah. I feel like our job as therapists is we're sort of a witness and a guide. And, we're witnessing something that can be really hard sometimes, but we're also guiding, but we're not ultimately responsible for their lives. That we're doing everything we can to help them, but at the end of the day, they get to make the choices that they want to make about their lives. I also think consultation groups are really important, and in the book I write about this for those of you who aren't in the field, and there are so many here who are. We have consultation groups where we talk about our cases, because we are in a room where it's a very odd profession to be working alone, where nobody sees your work product except the person who you're trying to help, right? So there are no checks and balances on that. So it's really important that I've always gone to a weekly consultation group where we talk about our cases and we hear other therapists and clinicians give their thoughts about different cases. And I think that's really helpful too, so you're not carrying that all by yourself. But I will say one big misconception about being a therapist. People say, oh, it must be so hard. You hear all these depressing stories and trauma. And I think it's the most uplifting profession that I can think of. You know, and I have lots of different kinds of professions that I do. And being a therapist is the one that I think is the most meaningful. I think you see these heroic moments in people's lives where it's like the smallest thing, like I didn't yell back, right? I mean, for someone who like has been a yeller like their whole life, I didn't yell back, and here's what I did instead. Or I actually listened to my partner or my child. I actually was kind to myself, right? So what I see is I see people change in dramatic ways. I see people's lives take a different turn than they ever thought possible. And it doesn't always work suddenly, right? It takes time. But you see change over time in this way. So I feel like when people talk about burnout, yeah, consultation groups, know what your role is. Don't schedule people without a break in between to eat. Oh my God, like try doing a session on an empty stomach. Don't do that. Go to the bathroom. Okay, like these are all things, these are like rookie mistakes that I made. You know, it was like, oh, I'll just schedule them like this. No, you need to take some time for yourself. But I feel like it's like one of the most uplifting human endeavors that I feel like it's a privilege to be a part of.
Well, thank you, Lori. Thank you for showing us the humanity in it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.